The cold did not just bite. It consumed. It was a living thing, a predator of white teeth and howling breath that hunted Martha and her mother through the skeletal trees. Each step was a negotiation with oblivion. The snow, once a gentle blanket, was now a thigh-deep trap, stealing the warmth from her limbs with every labored plunge. Her own breath plumed and froze against the thin wool scarf tied over her face, the tiny crystals of ice a cruel mockery of the life still flickering within her. 26 years old. She felt 100. 26, and her world had been reduced to the fragile weight of the old woman leaning against her. The rhythmic, shallow rasp of her mother's breathing a metronome counting down their final moments. Have you ever been so thoroughly erased? So completely discarded that your very existence feels like an apology? Martha knew that feeling. It was in the burn of her lungs, the ache in her bones, the hollow space where a husband's warmth used to be. It was in the memory of her brother-in-law, Franklin, his face a mask of pinched propriety as he'd stood on the porch of the home she had shared with Henry. "It's not practical, Martha," he had said, his words as cold and sharp as the November air. "A widow and an invalid. The farm requires strong hands." My hands, he had given them a day. One day to pack what they could carry. He had called it charity. She called it exile. Now, with every ounce of her strength focused on holding her 80-year-old mother upright, she understood it was a death sentence. Agnes mumbled something, a name lost to the wind, her head lolling against Martha's shoulder. Her skin, where it peeked from the edge of her bonnet, was the color of old parchment, tinged with a terrifying blue. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through Martha's exhaustion. She had to keep moving. For Henry, for the promise she had made him on his deathbed. His hand, calloused and warm, holding hers. "Take care of her, Martha. Take care of Mama." It was the only thing left of him. Promise. And it was a weight she would carry until the snow took them both. The world had dissolved into a maelstrom of white. There was no sky, no ground, only the punishing gale that tore at their clothes and drove ice into their eyes. Martha could no longer feel her feet. The numbness was a terrifying sort of peace, a siren song from the deep, beckoning her to simply stop, to lie down, to let the snow do its work. It would be so easy, a final surrender. Her mother, Agnes, had gone silent, her weight a dead thing against Martha's side. For a horrifying moment, Martha thought she was gone, that her heart had finally given up its tired, 80-year struggle. She stopped, turning her body to shield the old woman from the worst of the wind, and pressed her frozen fingers against her mother's neck. A pulse, faint, thready, a butterfly's wing against the coming winter, but it was there. A desperate, ragged sob escaped Martha's throat, freezing instantly on her lips. She was failing Henry, failing her mother, failing herself. The memory of Franklin's face returned, his eyes devoid of pity, seeing them only as burdens to be shed. He was warm now, sitting by a fire in her home, eating her food from her plates. The injustice of it was a hot coal in her gut, a single point of heat in the encroaching frost. She sank to her knees, the snow greedily swallowing her, pulling Agnes down with her. This was it, the dark night of the soul she'd read about in her father's old books. A place beyond hope, where all that remained was the cold, hard truth of one's own insignificance. She looked up into the swirling chaos, not in prayer, but in defiance. She had been a good wife, a good daughter. She had worked hard. She had loved deeply. Could not end here. It would not. That small, hot coal of rage began to glow, to spread, pushing back against the encroaching numbness. She would not give Franklin the satisfaction of their ghosts. She would not let her mother's last breath be a gasp of frozen air. With a groan that was more animal than human, she forced herself to her feet, hauling Agnes with her. One more step, then another. It was not sight that found it, but touch. Stumbling forward, blind in the whiteout, her outstretched hand brushed against something solid. Not a tree, smooth and round with bark, but something flat, unyielding, and splintered. Wood, planks. Her frozen mind struggled to make sense of it. She pushed against it, her shoulders scraping along a rough surface. A wall. She followed it, her heart beginning a frantic, painful drumming against her ribs. One step, then another, her hand never leaving the lifeline of the weathered wood. She rounded a corner, then another. A structure. Small, impossibly small, but it was real. Through a momentary lull in the storm, she saw it. A dark, hunched shape against the overwhelming white. A tiny cabin, no bigger than a corn crib, nearly swallowed by the drifts. Its roof sagged, and the darkness of a single, shuttered window stared out like a hollow eye. It looked as abandoned and forgotten as she felt. A perfect mirror of their own condition, cast out and left to the mercy of the elements. Yet it was standing. It had endured. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through her. Shelter. She half-dragged, half-carried Agnes to the front, searching for a door. She found it, a simple plank door with a leather thong for a handle, sealed shut with a thick crust of ice. It wouldn't budge. For a moment, despair threatened to reclaim her. To have come so close only to be denied. But the rage, the promise, the sheer, stubborn refusal to die, it was afire now. She laid Agnes down as gently as she could in the meager lee of the wall and turned to face the door. She would not be denied. She braced her shoulder and threw her entire weight against it. A crack but no give. Again. The wood groaned in protest. Pain shot through her shoulder, a sharp, searing agony, but she ignored it. She was a force of nature now, a match for the storm. She slammed against it again, and again, her grunts lost in the howl of the wind. With a final, explosive crack, the ice shattered, and the door flew inward, revealing a square of perfect, silent darkness within. The smell of cold dust, of long-abandoned solitude, wafted out to meet her. It was the most beautiful scent she had ever known. The darkness inside the cabin was absolute, a palpable void that seemed to drink the raging storm into silence. The instant Martha pulled her mother over the threshold and forced the groaning door shut, the world changed. The deafening roar of the wind was reduced to a low, mournful whistle through the chinks in the walls. It was still brutally cold, the air inside as frigid as the air outside, but it was a still cold, a quiet cold. Cold they could fight. Martha's first priority was Agnes. She guided her mother to the far wall and eased her down onto the packed earth floor, propping her against the rough-hewn logs. The old woman was barely conscious, her shivering so violent it seemed her bones might shake apart. They needed fire, and they needed light. Martha's eyes slowly adjusted, discerning faint shapes in the gloom. A stone hearth, black with ancient soot, dominated one wall. A crude cot with a rotted rope mattress stood in a corner. The floor was littered with debris, leaves and dirt that had found their way through the cabin's many wounds. It was a ruin, but it was their ruin. Her hands, clumsy with cold, fumbled inside her cloak for the small, precious bundle she had guarded for days. A tinderbox, a small block of tallow, and 3 carefully saved matches. 3 chances. Her fingers were so numb she could barely grasp the first match. She struck it against the stone of the hearth. It flared, a glorious, impossible star in the darkness, and immediately extinguished. Her heart sank. 2 chances left. She took a deep breath, cupping her hands, shielding the next match with her own body. She struck it. This time the flame caught, wavering, threatening to die. With painstaking care, she touched it to the tallow-soaked wick she'd prepared. It sputtered, then caught, casting a weak, flickering yellow light that pushed the oppressive darkness back into the corners. The small flame illuminated a miracle. A small pile of dry kindling and a few split logs stacked neatly beside the hearth, left by the cabin's last, long-gone occupant. A gift from a ghost. With trembling gratitude, she began to build the fire, her movements slow and methodical. Kindling first, then the smaller logs, arranged to allow the air to breathe life into the flame. The first curl of smoke was acrid, but then the wood caught properly, and a small, hungry fire began to crackle in the hearth. Warmth. It was a tide, slowly advancing, pushing back the cold that had settled deep into their bones. She stripped her mother's wet outer garments and wrapped her in their only dry blanket, positioning her as close to the growing fire as was safe. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Martha allowed herself to stop. She sat on the dirt floor, the firelight dancing on her face, and simply watched her mother breathe. The blizzard did not relent. For 3 days and 3 nights, the world outside was an endless, howling vortex of white. The tiny cabin became their entire universe, a fragile ark adrift on a frozen sea. Time blurred into a simple, primal rhythm dictated by the needs of the fire and the frail life of her mother. Martha's existence shrank to a series of essential, repeated tasks. Stoke the fire. Melt snow in the rusty bucket she'd found. Coax spoonfuls of warm water between Agnes's cracked lips. Chafe the old woman's hands and feet to keep the blood moving. Turn her to prevent sores. Listen to her breathing. And watch the small pile of wood diminish with terrifying speed. Each log she placed on the fire was a choice, a trade of future security for immediate survival. The hunger came next, a gnawing, hollow ache that twisted in her stomach. Their own meager supplies, a half loaf of stale bread and a small wedge of hard cheese, were gone by the second day. On the third morning, a desperate search of the cabin's corners yielded a treasure beyond imagining. Tucked away on a high shelf, forgotten by time, was a small, sealed tin of lard and a hardened sack containing a few handfuls of dried beans. She wept, not from sadness, but from a gratitude so profound it felt like a physical blow. She boiled the beans for hours in the melted snow, adding a spoonful of the precious lard for richness. The smell filled the small space, a savory promise of life. The broth she spooned into her mother's mouth was the first real nourishment Agnes had received in days. That evening, her mother spoke for the first time, her voice a dry whisper. Henry, he would be proud. Martha, huddled by the fire, simply nodded, her throat too tight for words. The cabin, which had at first seemed a tomb, was slowly becoming a womb. It was protecting them, nurturing them. Martha felt a strange sense of ownership, of connection to the rough logs and the smoky hearth. Her hands, raw and blistered from splitting the last of the logs with a flat rock, were proof of her right to be here. She was no longer a victim of the storm. She was its equal, a stubborn, resilient force tending a small flame of life in the heart of the vast, indifferent wilderness. The physical toll was immense, but with it came a clarity she had never known. This was what it meant to be alive. Not to have things, but to do things. To fight, to endure, to make a fire in the dark. When the storm finally broke, the silence was as stunning as the previous. And Martha cautiously pushed open the door to a world remade, sculpted in brilliant, blinding white under a sky of piercing blue. The snow was piled in massive drifts against the cabin, but a path had been kept clear by the wind's strange currents. The air was so cold it felt sharp in her lungs, but it was clean, pure. It was the first day of a new life. The grueling work of survival now shifted to the monumental task of living. The cabin, their savior, was deeply flawed. The wind still found its way through 100 tiny gaps between the logs. The roof leaked melted snow in a steady drip 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 near the far wall. It needed to be healed just as they did. Martha became a creature of labor. Her days found a new rhythm, one governed not by a clock, but by the sun and the needs of their small fortress. She spent hours gathering firewood, venturing further into the silent forest each day, her axe, a rusty, dull head she'd found in the woodpile and painstakingly affixed to a sturdy branch, becoming an extension of her own arm. She learned the language of the trees, which would burn hot and fast, which smoldered slow and long. She used the axe to strip bark and harvest moss, which she mixed with mud from a nearby semi-frozen creek bed. Then came the chinking. With her bare hands, she forced the thick, icy paste into every crack and crevice of the cabin walls, sealing them against the wind. Her fingers would grow numb, then ache with a fiery pain as they warmed by the fire at night. But with each sealed gap, the cabin grew quieter, warmer, more whole. It was her work. It was her home. Agnes, slowly regaining her strength, would sit by the fire, her hands busy mending their tattered clothes with a needle Martha had fashioned from a sharpened bird bone. Her quiet, steady presence was a constant reassurance. She didn't offer advice. She offered witness. She watched her daughter transform, her body growing leaner and harder, her face etched with a resolve that had not been there before. One afternoon, Martha successfully repaired the worst of the leaks in the roof, using scavenged bark and pine pitch. That night, lying on her cot of woven pine boughs, she listened not to the drip of water, but to the gentle sigh of the wind over a solid roof. It was the sound of victory. She had not merely found shelter. She was creating it. She was no longer the discarded widow. She was the architect of her own world, building it one log, one stone, one painful, triumphant handful of mud at a time. Spring arrived not as a gentle guest but as a messy, reluctant thaw. The world dripped and oozed, the great mounds of snow shrinking to reveal the forest floor, rich with the smell of damp earth and new life. For Martha, it was a revelation. She discovered the cabin was nestled in a small, sheltered clearing, bordered by a fast-running creek and a stand of tall pines that had buffered them from the worst of the winter winds. The land was good. She could feel it. The grind shifted from sealing and warming to clearing and planting. She spent weeks turning the soil with a sharpened, fire-hardened stick, her back and shoulders screaming in protest. She had no seeds, but the forest provided. She learned to identify the tender shoots of wild onions, the bitter but nourishing leaves of dandelion, the starchy roots of cattails down by the creek. Her diet, once a desperate scramble for calories, became a study in wild sustenance. Agnes, now able to walk about the clearing, proved to have a deep well of old knowledge, pointing out edible plants her own mother had taught her about decades ago. One day, a man appeared at the edge of the clearing. He was not a trapper or a lost traveler. He was Franklin. He sat atop a fine horse, his town clothes looking absurdly out of place against the wild backdrop of the forest. He stared at the wisp of smoke curling from the cabin's mud and stick chimney, at the small patch of turned earth, at Martha herself, who stood straight and still, her hands stained with dirt, her face browned by the sun. He looked not at a survivor, but at an aberration, something that should not exist. His expression was not one of relief, but of profound, almost comical confusion. He had ridden out, he would later claim, on a charitable mission to recover their bodies for a proper burial, a final act of familial duty. The truth was colder. He had come to ensure they were truly gone, to erase the last loose end of his brother's life before selling the farm outright. He had expected to find bones picked clean by wolves. Instead, he found a home. He dismounted slowly, his polished boots sinking into the soft earth. He took in the scene, the neatly stacked firewood, the clean-swept dirt yard, the sight of old Agnes sitting on a stump in the sun, looking healthier than she had in years. The sight of them, alive and rooted, was an affront to the world as he understood it. It was an accusation. Franklin walked toward her, his face a careful mask of practiced solemnity that was quickly dissolving into disbelief. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze sweeping over the crude but sturdy cabin, the fishing weir she had started building in the creek, the snares hanging from a low-hanging branch. He saw not a home, but evidence of a squalor he could not comprehend. "Martha," he said, his voice tight with a strange mixture of shock and disapproval. "Merciful heavens! You are alive." It was not a question but an accusation. Martha simply watched him, her hands resting on her hips. She did not feel the urge to run to him, to weep with relief at the sight of a familiar face. That part of her had been frozen out during the blizzard and had never thawed. The woman he was looking at was not the one he had cast out. "We are, Franklin. No thanks to you." The words were quiet, level, and devoid of the anger he might have expected. They were simply a statement of fact, as plain and solid as the ground beneath her feet. He flinched, a flicker of indignation in his eyes. "I did what was necessary. The farm. It was no place for, well, it seems Providence has seen fit to preserve you." He gestured vaguely at the cabin. "Living like this, it is not fit. I have made arrangements in town." There is work for you in the laundry, and a room for your mother at the church poorhouse. It is time to end this spectacle. He spoke as if he were offering a great kindness, rescuing them from their own foolishness. He expected gratitude. He expected her to fall at his feet, overjoyed to be returning to the civilized world he represented. He could not have been more wrong. Martha felt a slow, cold calm settle over her. She looked from his clean, soft hands to her own, which were calloused and cracked, with dirt permanently etched into the lines of her palms. She looked at his pinched, pale face, and then at her mother, who was watching them with quiet, knowing eyes. The laundry, the poorhouse, a return to dependence, to being a burden, an object of pity, a return to being invisible. She had built a world with her own 2 hands, and he was offering to trade it for a cage. No, she said. The word was small, but it landed with the weight of a felled tree. Franklin stared at her as if she had spoken in a foreign tongue. No? What do you mean, no? Martha, be sensible. This is a hovel. You are alone out here. It is not safe. It is not proper. His voice rose, laced with the frustration of a man whose authority was being questioned for the first time. He was used to acquiescence, especially from women he considered his lessers. But Martha was no longer his lesser. She was sovereign in this small kingdom of mud and wood. We are not alone, she said, her voice still infuriatingly calm. We have each other. And we have this. She gestured not just to the cabin, but to the entire clearing, the tall pines, the gurgling creek, the turned earth promising sustenance. This is our home, Franklin. We made it. He let out a short, incredulous laugh. You made a mud hut. My brother, Henry, would be ashamed to see you like this. The mention of Henry was a deliberate cruelty, a final attempt to wound her, to remind her of her place as a grieving, dependent widow. But the tactic failed. The memory of Henry was no longer a source of pain, but a foundation of strength. It was his promise that had driven her through the snow. It was his belief in her that had fueled the building of this very life. Henry would be proud that I kept my promise to him, she retorted, her voice gaining an edge of steel. He would be proud that his mother is safe and warm. He would be ashamed of you, Franklin. Ashamed that you would leave your own kin to die in a blizzard for the sake of a few acres of land. The truth of her words struck him silent. A flush crept up his neck. He had no response. He had come expecting to find weakness and desperation, to play the part of the magnanimous savior. Instead, he found a strength he could not bully, a self-sufficiency that rendered him completely irrelevant. Her survival was not just an inconvenience. It was a judgment against him. He saw in her eyes that she needed nothing from him. Not his help, not his approval, and certainly not his pity. His power over her was gone. He was a ghost here, a representative of a world that no longer mattered. Without another word, he turned, his movements stiff and angry. He mounted his horse, yanked viciously on the reins, and rode away, disappearing back into the trees. Martha watched him go, feeling not triumph, but a profound and final release. She had not won a battle. She had simply refused to fight on his terms. She was free. Months turned into a full year. The small patch of tilled earth became a thriving garden of beans, squash, and hardy greens grown from seeds she had traded for with a passing trapper. The cabin stood strong, a testament to her labor, its walls dark and solid, its chimney breathing a steady, comforting plume of smoke. Martha and Agnes had found a rhythm, a peaceful cadence of life dictated by seasons and simple needs. They were no longer just surviving. They were living deeply and quietly. One evening in late autumn, as the leaves were turning to fire and gold, a man stumbled into the clearing. He was old, his face a roadmap of hard years, and he leaned heavily on a gnarled walking stick. He was a fur trapper named Silas, and a fever burned in his eyes. He had been tracking a line of snares when the sickness had taken him, leaving him weak and disoriented. He saw the light from her shuttered window and had staggered toward it, expecting nothing, but hoping for a moment's rest before the end. He collapsed at the edge of her garden. Martha, coming out to fetch water from the creek, found him there. She did not hesitate. She and Agnes helped the delirious man into the cabin, settling him onto her own cot of pine boughs. For a week, she nursed him, forcing spoonfuls of hot broth and willow bark tea between his lips. She cleaned his fevered brow with cool cloths. She sat with him through the long nights, listening to his rambling memories of mountains and rivers, of a life lived on the fringes. He was the first outsider to enter their world since Franklin's disastrous visit. He was an observer. As the fever broke and his strength slowly returned, Silas watched them. He saw the quiet efficiency of Martha's movements, the deep, unspoken bond between the young woman and her aged mother. He saw the ingenuity in everything, the smooth stones used for grinding, the neatly repaired roof, the clever system of snares she had set by the creek. He saw a world built not with money or power, but with resilience, knowledge, and an unbreakable will. He had spent his life in the wilderness, and he recognized its spirit in her. This was not a place of lack, but a place of profound abundance. One evening, sitting by the fire, he finally spoke of it. "You built all this? By yourself?" Martha looked up from the rabbit skin she was stretching. "My mother and I," she corrected gently. "We built it together." Silas shook his head, a look of deep respect in his weathered eyes. "I've seen men, strong men, broken by less than a winter out here. What you've done, it's a miracle." Martha simply smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "It's not a miracle, Silas. It's just work." But he knew better. He had stumbled into a sanctuary, a place of quiet power forged in the heart of the storm, and he knew he would not be the last to find his way here. Silas stayed until the first snow fell, his strength fully returned. He helped Martha bank the cabin with earth and leaves for the coming winter, and showed her how to build a better, more effective deadfall trap. When he left, he did not just take his furs. He took a story of the widow in the hidden clearing, a woman who had faced down the wilderness and made it her home. The story traveled, as such stories do, passed in quiet tones around lonely campfires and in trading posts. It became a whisper of hope for the desperate, the dispossessed, the ones, like Martha, who had been cast out. The following spring, another family found their way to the clearing. A man named Thomas, his wife, Sarah, and their 2 young children. Their story was a familiar one. A failed homestead, a lost crop, and the cold indifference of a world that had no room for failure. They arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a deep, weary fear in their eyes. They had heard the story of the widow and had followed the creek for days, hoping it was true. Martha met them not with suspicion, but with a bowl of hot stew and an open heart. She saw herself in their exhaustion, her own desperate journey reflected in their faces. She did not offer charity. She offered partnership. She showed Thomas which trees were best for building and how to notch the logs. She gave Sarah seeds from her own carefully saved stock and taught her which wild roots were safe to eat. She helped them build their own small cabin on the other side of the clearing, a mirror of her own. The sound of Thomas's axe striking would become a new music in the clearing, a harmony to the rhythm of her own life. A community was being born, not by design or decree, but organically, out of shared hardship and mutual respect. One evening, as the sun set, casting long, golden shadows through the pines, Martha stood by her door and looked across the clearing. A curl of smoke rose from the chimney of the new cabin, a sign of life, of family, of warmth. She was no longer alone. The woman who had been abandoned had become a founder. The life that had been saved in this place was now giving life to others. Perhaps you feel it too, that sense of being overlooked, of your own strength being invisible to a world that only values noise and power. But like a seed buried under the snow, that strength is waiting. It is waiting for the pressure, for the dark night, for the moment you decide to stop running from the storm and instead build a shelter in its heart. Your own clearing is waiting. You just have to start building.